Now, if you're anything like me, the great game, as it's called, or foreign policy, is an almost complete black box. And so, in many cases, you have to turn to someone who seems to know what they're talking about. And over the past couple months, it's become very apparent that Matt, or the Prudentialist as he's known on YouTube, seems to be one of the brightest voices in foreign policy on the dissident right. So, welcome to the Jack Burton Show, Matt.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm honored.
Good. I'm glad you can make it out. So, my intention with this is not to ask you about the specifics of what's happening in Donbass or anything like that, because to be perfectly honest, I don't know anything about that. But I really do want to get a little bit more of your background and kind of philosophy on foreign policy. So just big picture, if you could tell us what is the objective or what is the purpose of foreign policy?
Well, foreign policy is just another extension of what government does at home. What happens at home often is a reflection of what you will do abroad, but foreign policy is mainly to achieve diplomatic, strategic, and economic goals for a country that are within what is identified as the national interest.
So that kind of dovetails into my next question. So I'm in business school and kind of from that world, and there's this concept of stakeholders, right? Which is essentially like who is impacted and who gets to have a say in the decision. So who would you say should be and who are the stakeholders when it comes to foreign policy?
I mean, here in the U.S., mainly just because we've been so deindustrialized, that question does always makes you think kind of straight to finance because, the United States really, since we've moved to be the world's reserve currency, that plays a major role in how we interact with the rest of the world. It's why you get to see a lot of emphasis and attention being played on Russia, asking for gas to be paid in rubles, or how they reacted to getting kicked out of the SWIFT system. So obviously, finance in sort of the financial sector of the United States would be a stakeholder to keep in mind. But at the same time, again, because I do believe that a lot of foreign policy begins at home based on what you need and what you need to accomplish at home for your citizens and those that live here, you also have to consider, the energy sector, the oil and gas industry. Just what makes it so interesting with America and other nations that have sort of a more mixed economies is that the U.S. does have a very sort of incestuous relationship because so much of our, quote unquote, private sectors of the economy are heavily subsidized. They're also, or don't mind having kickbacks or things like that. I mean, for us, the national defense industry, right? I mean, our Secretary of Defense, when he was accepted to come on as the Secretary of Defense, was still a sitting board member of Raytheon, one of the largest defense contractors in the United States. So it gets really complicated to say, well, who exactly are the stakeholders? Because you should really just see who's paying who and who's giving kickbacks to who. It's a really nasty cycle, but you should look at things like construction, mining. Where is our healthcare industry and sector coming from? R&D, I would say, would be a large stakeholder there, whether it's in pharmaceuticals, various forms of infrastructure, telecommunications, or even more, robust things like civil engineering.
Well, it's odd because obviously I have almost the mirror image view of that, right? Like coming kind of from the business world. Because there's been this big push, obviously in kind of the headlines, but also in the actual business schools themselves, to talk about ESG and this idea of like, oh, it's a corporate public partnership. They use different terms for it, but it's essentially the same idea.
Yeah.
And what's especially odd is the version you get in the classroom is very much as it says on the box. You know what? Like, oh, ESG is great because it allows us to improve the environment. But if you kind of dig beneath it, kind of past the like very surface level takes, you realize very, very quickly that it is this bizarre situation of trying to jockey for like favorable federal treatment or kind of trying to out edge your opponent. And so it's this odd situation where, and I guess it's like anything else, right? The descriptor is very kind of like noble and humanitarian sounding. And then you kind of get exactly one layer below that. And you realize, oh no, we've just added a whole nother level to the game, as it were.
Well, and that's the fun part about ESG, which I guess for the audience, right? It's environmental, social, and governance, sort of providing a formal outlook to what we've seen really with the much more socially active corporate, private side of things. I really do appreciate it, though. I think that sort of goes back to that old neo-reactionary concept of just like formalizing things, because really, I think ESG has done a fantastic job. It just, to me at least, destroying the private public distinction because it's just such a revolving door between the two. I mean, even in foreign policy, right? Like, there's always been this criticism that we assign diplomats to certain countries for the sole purpose that they were political donors or that they were operatives that assisted you in elections. Or that they're just someone that really provided a hefty check to you during on the campaign trail. So I definitely see where you're coming from there, and it's what makes it sort of interesting is that when we talk about Europe, for example, like, well, we're geopolitically concerned about Germany and Russia having a closer military or economic or strategic relationship. We should probably keep the two separate. We don't want them relying on Russian natural gas, for example. The United States has been adamant about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And conveniently, we would love to send cargo ship after cargo ship after cargo ship of American liquid natural gas over to Europe to sort of keep this dependency going and to maintain our relationship with Europe as it currently is, almost to a point where you could say client state. People call it the global American empire, or the big gay, which is always humorous, but there is a very clear imperial ambition, but it's not in that name. I think the best way I've heard it described was by political scientist and historian John G. Eikenberry. He had said that really, he says from 1945, I would argue really since 1896 and the Spanish-American War, that we've operated under some principle of liberal hegemony, that if you liberalize other states or can control them directly, they're not as likely to pose a threat to you because you're all ideologically the same. So you all have similar values of democracy, heads of government, markets, and open trade. So it does lead to an interesting point where this is sort of being formalized through ESG, through the promotion of these values and flags and days of recognition that, oh, we're an ideologically bent empire, and here we are.
Well, and that's the odd thing, and I guess that is kind of the $1,000,000 question if you're a dissident, right? Which is this good news in the sense, oh, wow, they're so incompetent, they can't keep up the charade anymore? Or is it bad news, in which case, oh, they're so powerful, they don't feel like they need to? But I do think it is very much, by being formalized, it is better in a way. Like before it was kind of easy to say like, oh, well, we're invading for freedom. Something is like taught as something is, I'm struggling for, something as cliched as that. Right. And really, you're looking like, well, OK, those missiles cost an awful lot. And, we needed to do X, Y, Z, just checking off boxes. But so do you have any take on that? And not to just completely get far afield, but.
Oh, sure. I mean, that's always been the $64,000 question. I mean, it's the $1,000,000 question adjusted for inflation. But whether sort of like the system is weak on its own incompetency, or is it strong enough that it really doesn't care for the rules? And you can see in some instances where it looks like it's incredibly weak, like, for instance, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, or perhaps our situation with naval readiness. But at the same time, it's just like the system or the regime or whatever you want to call it is very capable of maintaining absolute media control. It's very difficult to get out a dissenting point of view from another country. I mean, we can just look in response to how the Western world, pretty much led through by the United States, managed to silence the Russian media, silence the Russian press, ban people off Twitter, get them on Telegram and so on, to a point where the German government wants to get rid of Telegram. I mean, it illustrates, I think, to some instance that, the gay is here to stay for as long as they want it to, because you do have so much private industry propping it up. It is very profitable for ESG. I mean, even in the American Affairs Journal, which is sort of a right-leaning publication, they were talking about, well, what are the benefits and trade-offs to ESG? And still, I mean, both sides can recognize it's incredibly profitable to be investing in these things, because you're creating these make-ready work jobs to talk about things where you can then have people writing white papers about feminist foreign policy and bride price and how to address terrorism in foreign countries. It is really this fantastic patronage system that has really bypassed the formal rules of the Pendleton Act for civil service, because now we know what the universities are, right? Like, we know that they kind of help formalize and indoctrinate and get you to play the game. And if you get your connections right, then yeah, you can have a cushy job at a think tank making 6 figures a year talking about some obscure country in a faraway place whose quarrels you have no, familiarity or relation to.
Well, and it is odd because I know people like that, right? And like being kind of, let's just say generally, like kind of on the cusp of the managerial class, right? you know these people, and you talk to them at parties, and you're like, okay, well, what do you do? And you get about a 6-minute diatribe about how scraping social media in sub-Saharan Africa is actually a very important thing that we need to fund. And it's just a little bit odd because this person I know is it does feel like patronage, right? Like they're a brilliant person, but they're essentially doing something completely useless, but they are essentially being paid, right? Like they are, I mean, literally, they are being given a position with a certain amount of prestige and a certain amount of money. And in exchange, they support the regime, no questions asked, And I guess that is just patronage. It's just the modern version of it.
Well, yeah, and I mean, there's also that desire to find there's some entrepreneurship to it, right? Like, oh, we haven't covered this. I should come up with some kind of business model in order to receive grants or to receive attention. Because if I can make this sound important, then one, I'm feeding my ego because I'm now giving myself a ridiculous amount of power, even if it's over a hyper niche subject. You know that you'll get called on to write something, or that you'll be on the news as a panelist guest or whatever for 5 minutes, right? Like your name is out there. People wish to be seen and have their 5 minutes of fame. But at the same time, right, it also will play a huge influence on how policy is conducted. And that's also the depressing thing, because odds are what you write will become policy, because Congress doesn't really write laws anymore. I mean, between lobbying and just shell legislation that says, oh, the director of this hyper specific branch in the Department of State will do X. And then the Department of State's little office position in the middle of nowhere has to read those rules, as vague as they are, and interpret them and do as they wish.
So to slightly change topics and pivot a little bit, I know that you are an Orthodox Christian, and I know that you are also associated with, I don't know how strongly, right, that kind of the neo-realist, if I'm correct, school of foreign policy, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So I'm always interested, because you obviously believe in personal moral agency, but do you believe that there can be such thing as a moral state actor? And like, where's the breakdown between personal moral agency and kind of the rule of kings? Like, where is that point?
Well, it's a good question, and I mean that's the thing is that for myself, and I mean really anyone who would take their faith in Christianity seriously, I'm not one to usually engage in sort of interdenominational spurgery. I think our enemies take advantage of that too much, but I believe in what Christ and the church teaches, and so that to me is the objective sense of morality, because to me this is the true faith, and that's the way that I'm going to conduct myself, or at least try my best to. Right? Lord knows that no man is perfect, but when it comes to, say, on the broad scale of morality, it's not like we're seeing a Christian nation. No nation calls themselves that, as much as sort of American boomer cons like to argue that America is a Christian country. Because I mean, we've kind of fallen from that, even in sort of.
Excuse me, Matt. We're a Judeo-Christian country, and there's
Well,
nothing wrong with that.
Well, according to various, rabbis and Jews on Twitter, apparently they don't like that title anymore. So those terms are acceptable in my book. But needless to say, when it comes to like morality, I mean, all states, all countries have a theology. All governments have a theology. Ours is, I mean, even if you call yourself an atheist, if you grew up in a Christian-oriented country, you're a Christian atheist. If you grew up in Baghdad, right, you're a Muslim atheist. Those things still shape your worldview. And for America, with its secular aspect of separation of church and state, it does operate in sort of this secular Christian background of how it perceives morality, of what is right and wrong. The problem with it is that it's not a very, those things, of course, to state power is really what you're operating under. It's more will to power, and it's not will to gospel. So let's go for, democracy. We're going to make the world safe for democracy, as Woodrow Wilson would say. Or more recently, what we saw in 2010 and 2011 is like with Afghanistan, we've got to make this like a safe place for women's schools and little girls getting educated. In the Obama administration, it was hashtag bring back our girls. Now, more recently, there's this big push to have a global decriminalization of homosexuality that started in the Trump administration. It's continued on here. And even those values translate back here at home, of course, because you have like the national strategy for gender equality and equity out of the Biden admin. So, I mean, to me, yeah, like there's the laws and the views and the teachings that I adhere to, but the states are going to operate in a lot of ways. And I think when you take a look at it from, say, elite theory, where you have this tiny organization, you have these managers all sort of believing into it, then a lot of that can be rationalized post hoc, because as we saw with that Afghanistan example I mentioned, a lot of the documents that came out of the Snowden leaks in 2013 said that the CIA and the State Department and the administration worked to help set that as the narrative post 2010, really post Iraq pullout. So morality is a very tricky thing in realism, because realism offers, in a lot of ways, I think the Austrian school does for economics, a value free form of analysis. So you can examine why nations do things the way that they do, why state actors or institutions or businesses do the things that they do. And you can say, well, this can be explained for X, Y, and Z factors, but you can't discount the ideology or what would a nation state or a political leader would consider right and wrong, because that will inevitably inform how that administration or how that autocrat or whatever operates on the national level.
So that's interesting, because I want to examine this in reverse. So
Okay.
if we kind of assume, which I'm quite willing to, that states work on kind of the laws of power, then if that is true, why should we as Americans, for example, feel guilty when our government does horrible things, causes a famine in Yemen, tortures our enemies in Abu Ghraib? Why should we, if we do, feel guilt for that?
So maybe it comes back to that old American adage that American patriotism is to criticize its government, but not to hate its people. Hate the government but not the nation, or hate the government or hate whoever's in charge but not the people. To me, that still is an old soul American adage thing that I still kind of cling on to. But the reason why I think that you do that is because even if your state operates sort of on that, you know, its own guided sense of morality, whether it's about bringing people to justice in a sense that may not be your definition of justice, or may not be the definition of justice that you voted for on the ballot box. um, we do get upset because, I mean, the rest of the world, we do look at regular people so often through the lens of what our government actors are doing, because everyone from Aristotle to Plato to Spengler to even more modern thinkers today will tell you time and time again that a lot of the things and how you conduct yourself at home will be reflected upon it abroad. So we know that the way that they treat a lot of things here, whether it's with grooming, whether it's with trying to have lockdowns like we saw in 2020 with churches, and just the complete dehumanization and deracination of the elderly and children, we're seeing a lot of that abroad. And I feel like we should be angry because whatever they do to us and we're mad about it, they're going to do to the rest of the world. And especially in a system where you have alliances and close knit connections like the Five Eyes agreement with pretty much the Anglosphere, so to speak, what we see in Australia, odds are, may come here, or at least be openly discussed. The same thing with various forms of surveillance. We've sort of been the head of that for the rest of the world, causing diplomatic issues, whether it's in Brazil or Germany. It it does cause other people to look at you as, your average regular American, to be looked at with a watchful eye or with scorn or with hatred. And that can cause issues if you decide to be a tourist. It causes issues if you decide to communicate with other people. We should be mad because we're individuals. I adhere to my own set of moral teachings based upon Christ and the church and scripture. I should be mad when my government does something that I consider to be immoral, because a lot of the things that our government does pretty much is immoral. I should be mad about that. And that should cause us to take a look at our own lives and to be concerned for our safety and to be concerned for other things. I mean, how could I not be morally outraged listening to government be so radically nonchalant about the use of nuclear weapons? Like when I'm seeing op-eds and articles saying that, oh, nuclear war could be good for the environment, or that we could feasibly win one or, we should do it now and preemptively strike. Like, maybe it's because we didn't grow up with things like By the Dawn's Early Light or all of those docudramas about what the day after would look like in nuclear war, but we should be morally gravely concerned that these people are trying to immanentize the eschaton.
Well, and I'm not sure if this is a petulant position on it, but there's something to me where I could kind of take the argument of, look, you don't understand what it's like in the real world. Sometimes you've got to do bad things to keep the people at home safe. Like, I think that's an overused argument, but I can see a case in which that's true. But to me, what's frustrating is it seems almost like the amount of morally reprehensible acts are, if anything, increasing, and the effectiveness is decreasing. So in an odd way, it almost feels like we're getting the worst end of both parts of that bargain. We neither have kind of a sense of moral superiority where it's like, oh, well, we lost, but we fought the good fight, and we're at the same time, it's like, at least from my perspective, it doesn't seem like the broader American empire is on the uptrend,
I think that the realist, like, you're not in their argument is always good in sort of criticizing the high ideals or the high morals of things, because once you get like an inside look behind the curtain, then yeah, people's opinions are obviously going to change about that. I mean, George Orwell, for all of his criticisms and his ideals and his political beliefs, he's attributed this quote, sort of apocrypha, but we sleep well at night because there are, men at night willing to do evil and harm on our behalf. And I think that it's something that we can't discount in our analysis. And that's why realism is still good to have. It's very hard for me to sometimes talk about the things that happen or done or what the reason or logic is for, because sometimes it is morally reprehensible. And sometimes our morals or ideals can cloud that. That's a very valid argument. But the thing is that at the current moment, if things look like they're bad for us, but to a point where we have, given up the ghost abroad, at least for this administration and regime, so to speak, they're still there. There could be things that we're not looking at. There may be inside information that we do not know. Most of the time, that tends to be the case, where it can look like to us things all around us are in unbelievable decline, but for them things could be just business as usual. The counterpoint to that would be, say, well, military readiness. Michael Anton was talking about this last year, where you look at like the Navy, you look at things about like putting out fires, you look at the idea that we're having miscommunication or mismanagement over COVID when it comes to certain military aspects, while at the same time we're focusing more on the political and the social messaging and training, and not so much about how to actually win conflicts or win engagements or field training exercises. But again, we don't know the ins and outs of that. But the question, I think, that always gets asked, and we're kind of seeing this play out with the Russia-Ukraine thing, is just that a lot of people that were like, oh wow, like so much death and destruction. And the realist school, Dr. Sumatra Mitra pointed this out. It's just like, listen, like you're witnessing sort of like a 21st century state versus state conflict, something that we really haven't seen happen aside from a few border clashes between India and Pakistan, but never something really full scale with significant military and troop deployments. Of course, this is going to be high. And the fact that it's been so high for both sides should really beg the question for national leaders and citizens alike, even in a sort of nominal democracy like the United States, that maybe the costs that we would incur for such things are a lot higher than we anticipate. And that should be taken under consideration as well.
Well, right. Like, I do think that the calculus has kind of changed, in much the same way that, and I'm by no means a subject expert, but in much the same way you kind of saw that. Yeah, fair enough, right? You kind of saw the calculus change 100 years ago, plus or minus. I think we're kind of seeing the same thing. And I think it's odd to me because there's a line that kind of runs around like the more libertarian circles talking about the U.S. military, where it's basically the idea is the U.S. military exists to fight the Cold War, and that's what it is designed to do. And you've kind of seen it attempt to turn other conflicts into the Cold War to kind of play to those strengths. And I wonder, this is pure, just baseless speculation, when we talk about, the end of history, But when that moment where it is an actual state-to-state conflict with the U.S., which will happen eventually, right? What that kind of like harsh realization will be like. I hope it's a quick one. I really do. But I guess from the outside looking in, I'm not confident in the people who have their hand on the wheel right now.
Well, I think it's a Hemingway quote, but there's a saying that goes, men and generals and nations perfect the art of fighting the last war just in time for the new one. And it was said, of course, around World War One, where the idea of grand Napoleonic style engagement and adventure was cut down to ribbons in the dirt and blood and mud of the trenches and machine gun fire. But I mean, for us, I think there is some degree that, yeah, we're doing things very similar to the Cold War. Like Russia, you want to some sort of strategic stalemate with NATO expansion and an overwhelming force to keep things at some kind of containment. In 2011, Obama had made the pivot to Asia, and there's been significant ramp up in Asiatic deployments, freedom of navigation operations. We have the AUKUS agreement between the UK and Australia for submarines. We have the Quad with India and two other countries in the region. It does illustrate that there's some, Cold War balances of containment, sort of George Kennan style in that regard. But at the same time, we did just spend 20 years fighting, sort of an occupatory, fighting counterinsurgency, kind of styles of operations. So I would imagine that things have definitely evolved since then, or if they've been able to synthesize the two very quickly. I mean, we can't discount the amount of information warfare that has been going on, just not only in terms of like, memes and propaganda, but we've also witnessed things in regards to ransomware attacks and holding national infrastructure hostage. I mean, this is something that's been talked about since like, over 10 years ago when I was in high school. Like I remember writing essays about the fact that cybersecurity is like the next forefront, that's going to be talked about in the 21st century. Not to mention things like, suborbital deployment and weapons. Like America has these things, you can look up like the X-37B project with the Air Force and so on. But that's the thing is that what's the first thing that dies at come first contact? It's usually the truth, and no plan survives contact with the enemy. So that realization will probably be very quick if there is a state versus state engagement with the United States. And I just pray to God that we don't experience it in terms of like attack on like U.S. soil, because that's something that we have not seen really ever since Pearl Harbor, or really since the Civil War.
Yeah, in any meaningful way, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious, and I think I probably know the answer, but do you think that the American empire is in decline? And if so, when do you think that started?
The question is really, is it in decline? I think that you're seeing, I think, a more formalized addition of its battle lines sort of being, or its borders, so to speak, in its territory. Um, South America will be a huge place where America sort of begins to fight with the Chinese, I think, for influence in the same way that Africa was considered the third world with the Soviets. Um, but to say that it is in decline, it may seem like the rafters are falling apart, but I mean it's still able to keep up a significant degree despite how different policies and how much whiplash, say, our European counterparts have faced. I think it's coming to terms with the fact that the economic reality matters, and it's sort of trying to run double time to catch up with itself, because this is where the ideology meets the reality. Wherein, for instance, we push for more trade with China. We want them to industrialize. We want them to get favored nation status with the World Trade Organization. Let's make it permanent. Let's have the giant sucking sound, as Ross Perot would say, with our free trade liberalization kind of policies, with our old trade agreement that we had with NAFTA. And now we're kind of rapidly catching up with it, where it's just like, we do need to focus on like semiconductor production at home. We should probably counter the rise of China's economy. We should be paying attention to where like other countries that have interests that are not America's interests in the rest of the world. And I mean, you can kind of see that being formalized with like the United Nations vote to condemn Russia over Ukraine, the 35 abstentions. Like those are your battle lines, or those that aren't willing to say no directly to the United States, but at the same time, like, we can't screw ourselves diplomatically or economically with, say, Russia or China. We just can't afford it. Especially countries like India or South Africa, for example. I don't know if it's going to rapidly collapse and be in decline. I mean, the last empire that we really saw fall on the world stage was the Soviet Union. And yes, things were really tough at home despite reforms or efforts to do so, but it was sort of almost velvet like. There was talks made, decisions arranged, plans made in conjunction with other powers, and it transitioned into something else. Now, will that come here? Who knows? I'm not one to really prognosticate on things with that lightly. I think that requires more serious thought than maybe the time we have allotted. But if we take the question at hand, right, like, if it is in decline, if so, how fast will we see it? um it is a nuclear power. It won't lose its, in global position or global teeth, so to speak, I think, as rapidly or as to the level the Soviet Union did, but it may resort itself to being a more regional focused player, like you do see with France, where there's the stronger focus on the economics, but France still has a robust military domestically. It still has nuclear weapons, and it still has its own foreign policy adventures abroad.
That was actually one of those things that I was surprised to learn, because you never see it in the media that that France still essentially operates a kind of colonies in Africa. Like they still have the gendarme, running around in Africa fighting, various militant groups, which is kind of a surprise to me, because if you're not deliberately looking for it, you'll never find it, at least in English language sources. So one of the other things that I want to slightly pivot, and I know I've been kind of leading you around by the nose here, is I want to talk about American exceptionalism. This is something I'm just fascinated by as a concept, right? Because it's been with America kind of from the start, right? We are the city on the hill. I mean, even the city I'm in is known, that's one of its many names, right? And I guess it kind of is part and parcel of the fact when you start a nation with essentially a series of, religious radicals going out to, kind of the unknown parts of the world. But even now, we kind of hear our own elites speak about America as exceptional or indispensable to the world. What do you think they mean when they say this? And how do you think other nations look at American exceptionalism?
So, I mean, you're right that exceptionalism, at least for the Americans, has been here really since the beginning. I mean, there's the heavy Anabaptist and Calvinist influence, right? I mean, the whole nation, or the whole colony of Rhode Island, so to speak, was caused because Roger Williams gets kicked out due to religious differences and wanting separation of church and state. George Bancroft wrote a fantastic 10-volume edition of the history of the United States in the 19th century, and he was just it's dribbling with language of just divine providence. We are chosen by God. We are to accomplish this great things. We are the pious and righteous people to do so. And even taking the line about Aquinas and the city of the hill, like we talk about that here with Washington D.C. and the splendor that it once had. um, American exceptionalism is baked into what the United States is, or at the very least, what the United States was. And in that regard, yeah, it's here to stay. I think that we've transformed it just slightly to where now we talk about American exceptionalism being this exceptional place where anyone can come in, and as long as they adhere to the right ideals, they can do so. Sort of this really weird mishmash of liberal civic nationalism. But the rest of the world probably has had the same view. That I think that if you were to like go back and look at political cartoons of the era, right? They made Ronald Reagan look like a cowboy. They made George W. Bush look like this, idiot, despite the fact that he was, Ivy League educated and comes from a strong political family dynasty that goes back to like the turn of the 20th century. It's just, the rest of the world probably does view it with some degree of annoyance. But I mean, if you had come out of two of the world's bloodiest conflicts of the 20th century, virtually unscathed, like none of your major nations or industrial centers were destroyed, your population grew, and you came out as the de facto world's leading superpower, then yeah, I mean that would be even more baked into the idea that yeah, we can do anything, we can accomplish anything. And the Cold War definitely showed that, the sense of patriotism, whether it's the moon landing or a defeat of communism, as we like to tell ourselves. That exceptionalism, I think, is here to stay. I do think that with any political theology, it will change to be in accordance to what you're supposed to believe in. So, America is this exceptional place where we respect, we have our gay pride flags flying all over the embassies, right? We have our, policies where, oh, no one believed in me and I can do whatever I want. That's why I work for the CIA. Like sort of this seething, I want to take revenge against my enemies type deal. Um, and I'm sure that, of course, if you have a different culture, if you have a different political belief, you have a different religion, then yeah, they're going to definitely look at that with some kind of skeptical resentment or animosity to you. I mean, the clash of civilizations is very, very real. I mean, Samuel P. Huntington wrote, like the West would love to modernize Islam, whereas the Islamic world would love to Islamify modernity. So things are bound for clash and conflict, both ideologically but also potentially for actual kinetic warfare.
So would you say that American exceptionalism is kind of a unique hubris, or do you think it is just an inevitable feature of empire?
I think all nations, at least some sense of national identity and pride, of course, will have that sense of identity and belief in themselves. I'm sure that if we were to, I mean, like the sort of the liberal concept, 19th century concept of the nation state, you can kind of see it about trying to identify what makes France France, right? Like Ernest Renan writes, "What is a nation?" America is well known with it, both for religious purposes as well as for political ones. I mean, there I think it exists everywhere. It just comes in different forms. I mean, in the UK, I think that a lot of people say like academic agent and others will call it like bulldog nationalism or Churchillian nationalism or biscuit tin sort of stuff where they sort of criticize the post-war narrative. It's just like, yes, Churchill, the war and the Queen, so to speak, and that's really what makes Britain Britain when there's probably, of course, thousands of years of it. Britain is an incredibly old country. You can't just make your entire political and national identity based around this sort of liberal post-war model. But I'd say all countries have it, at least those, I think, with a far more deep-seated political, ethnic, cultural tradition, rather than, say, Kazakhstan, which is just really beginning to get a national identity formulated out of a massacre that happened in the late 80s, because it used to be historically a territory and a place of various nomadic tribes in the steppe. So uh, you can see it where the idea of nation state really becomes to be formulated. Then yes, that identity has to become on, because if you want to stay in power, you've got to graft an identity that people can buy into to support you. And some places it's far more authentic than others.
Well, and I'm interested in that, right? That idea of like creating a national identity, because you do see it in kind of odd, like Kazakhstan's a great example, but I mean, in many ways, Ukraine is another interesting example of that, where it's like you kind of have to change your internal calculus based off of kind of, I guess, like the relative size and power of your nation state, right? Like there's a certain amount of kind of arrogance and national identity you can productively have if you are a great power, right? Like China is allowed a lot more kind of, I guess, leeway in this sense. You're allowed to be a little bit more chauvinistic if you've got a billion people. But if you're someone, let's just say, and I'm picking this off the tip of my tongue, I don't know how relevant this is, but if you're Moldova, it's a whole lot harder to start puffing up your chest and kind of swinging around, And it's odd because the tenets of nationalism, to a certain extent, kind of require that like differentiation. But it seems to me, at least, right, that the reality of how states work means that full nationalism isn't really like realistic or beneficial to every state, right?
Well, yeah, and I mean, like Moldova has its history with Romania, and now with the ongoing issues, it does raise certain questions about the national identity. I mean, Japan, of course, has been fundamentally transformed by the post-war world and its 1947 constitution. But a few years back, I think Shinzo Abe had sort of made a remark towards the Chinese in a public statement, saying, that we are the people of the samurai. And of course, even with the post war world, those two nations have historically a long history of each other between Chinese and Japanese invasions, occupations of Manchuria during the war. Uh, things that still are these cultural and political poking sore spots that still exist for these two countries that go back, hundreds and thousands of years. So I would agree with that. Yeah. I mean, even with China, right? Like we do make this big deal about the Uyghurs the same way that we did about Tibet. But I mean, the majority population in China, at least for the ruling class, is Han Chinese. And we're seeing an expression through the Communist Party of China and those in charge with its premier and its president, President Xi Jinping, that this is the Han Chinese example and expression of a Han Chinese nation state that wishes to sort of emerge powerful from what they call the century of humiliation. These things that if you have a history of actually being a nation or a people, and you now formalized that with country and borders and a population to tax and a military and trade, then yeah, I mean, that's going to play a much larger role in there. Whereas in places like Lebanon, where you have years of ethnic strife and a civil war that only ended 32 years ago, where the agreements that come out of it are about trying to have Christian and Muslim equal proportionate representation inside of the country, the identity of that nation is going to be torn very much based on what faith you believe in and how are you represented in government and who are you friendly with in your neighboring states, or do you like the Saudis, do you like the Syrians more, whose money would you be willing to take or to vote for? So yeah, I mean, it really does depend on your history and your geography in a lot of those instances.
So thank you so much for answering all of my at least direct foreign policy questions, Matt. So I actually didn't find your channel for foreign policy. I found it, and I can't remember which stream it was, but it was a very emotionally impactful stream where you were talking about returning to faith after a kind of a time of personal crisis. And I don't want to ask you anything you don't want to answer, but I'm curious, I guess, how would you rank, I guess, the importance Christians place on the real world and like the realities of governments and states, while keeping in mind that this the temporal world is not the only one, and that there's kind of a greater hope outside of, you know, like national success.
Well, this is where it sort of gets difficult, right? Because you're in the process of like converting and joining to a church, so you may not say something that's probably in line with it. But I mean, to me, right, a lot of the criticism that gets levied by Christians, I think, or against Christians in sort of these political spheres, this is that because you have an otherworldly kingdom that you will go to, right, that the focuses on the here and now are sort of secondary, or it doesn't matter as much to you and you can ignore it, or you can get people to join your church or whatever. You hear it a lot, especially from say more racially minded or say neo-pagan crowds. But I kind of always sort of just go throw back Matt 6:33 at them. For seek the kingdom of God and all of its righteousness and justice shall be brought unto you. And it's just, I have to do these things. Orthodoxy puts a significant emphasis on sort of the spiritual life, the hecaistic practice of, prayer by yourself and sort of in communion with God, and of course attending church and everything that comes with it. But my spiritual life also tells me that there's evil out there, and Christ didn't tell me to, just be silent and not say anything when great evil happens before me. You are to take up action against it. You are allowed to have, righteous anger. I mean, he threw out the money changers from the temple. He called out hypocrisy. He, tells us that we should approach these things with, those with true faith, or those with humility. The story of the publican and the Pharisee always comes to me right in that mind. It's just that you can be decked out in all the regalia you want. You can LARP as hard as you want, but if you're doing it inauthentically, what good is it for? Whereas the man that is at the entrance of the door with his head to his chest asking for forgiveness, that's a lot to me. I'm humble where I say that I don't know everything in that regard, especially when it comes to these international events. Like, one of the greatest benefits since I've started talking about the things that I study and the things that I continue to read up on is that I have an international audience, and that I can get perspectives from around the world and to get their take and the cultural identity and bias that comes with it. But for me, as that sort of return to faith, return to Christianity, it's just that yeah, I can witness great evil taking place and what's happening, and I would like it if there was a possibility that nations don't raise swords against nation. But I also recognize that not everyone is going to share my beliefs or accept the good news, so to speak. And I have to be prepared for that. We do beat our swords into plowshares, but that doesn't mean that we live a life completely without swords. We can't just rambunctiously rise up, though, either, right? He who lives by the sword dies by the sword. I don't think that you should be as, you know, carry that. You should carry the big stick, right, and speak softly, but I don't think that you should be rambunctiously engaging in reckless adventurism either, because it's not like the last 30 years of that sort of foreign entanglements, as Washington warned against, has been good for us in terms of the loss of blood and treasure, but also for the rest of the world. Um, and I really do think that that informs my worldview a lot. Is that I hold these moral beliefs and these theological practices that I innately believe in, and my heart is open to them. But at the same time, I hold sort of this amoral worldview because I have to explain things, because not everyone holds the same beliefs and practices that I do. So it's a tight rope to walk, but it comes par for the course, I guess, in holding deeply held religious conviction and faith, while the rest of the world may not, or the rest of the world acts based on the realpolitik of things.
Well, right, and that's actually a lot of what I was trying to get at with some of my earlier questions. That there is this tension, right, between what ought to be and what is. And in many cases it's difficult because you see this. I don't mean you personally, just you generally see this in your own life of like, oh, I know what is right, and yet here I am, you know acting essentially immorally or amorally, right? And so I think it is at least helpful and humbling to a certain extent to recognize that pattern, right? Because in much the same way that on the international scale with all of those incentives, people act selfishly. It's like, oh well, I do too. And that doesn't by any means excuse either action, but it is a very human thing.
Well,
And
yeah, and no, you should expect, right, your leadership to maybe take some interest in you. Although, I
right.
think we can kind of see at home that that's maybe not the case, or not the case for everybody that's inside the country these days. But yeah, and you were going to go on something. I'll go ahead. Sorry.
No, so what I wanted to say is I like what you had to say about evil, because really I think that the left and right dichotomy is, I think, almost completely useless in most cases. But I think that really one of the most fundamental in or out group issues is what is the nature of evil? And is evil real or not? Because in one case, evil is a pathology, right? Is an illness that affects people. Like it is something that comes either from like a disability, a disorder, or it's something that people a long time ago did that we don't have to worry about anymore. And I think that you see that in like certain both progressive, but in a weird way also kind of Nietzschean worldviews, right? Which is that evil is not something baked into the heart of man. But if you have kind of the view that evil is a real thing in the world, and that evil isn't just kind of this like bizarre spiritual miasma, but it is a force that needs to be countered. And if it isn't countered, it wins. It's kind of this like eternal rot. And I think that that worldview is almost essential to kind of how you view everything else, right? Like I guess you both need you both need to understand the nature of the good and the nature of evil. And not to sound too dualistic, but I think if you have a deficiency in understanding either one of those, it seems to be that your worldview must fall apart.
Yeah, no, I agree. That you have to. I mean, even for non-Christians and those that really don't have a religious belief, I've heard Morgoth say that only a god can save us, right? Like there is a spiritual force. And I know a lot of people will sort of scoff at the idea that there's some kind of spiritual warfare going on. But I don't think that anyone can just look at what's happening sort of even through scrolling your Twitter feed or even what's trending right now and say, maybe there's some kind of evil force at play. I mentioned formalization earlier, and that's something that I kind of like when sort of like the Lord's Prayer is done within like Orthodox services, is that instead of just deliver us from evil, it's lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. We sort of formalize it there, where it's just like, yeah, like deliver us from Satan. Like this is like we know he's real. If Satan was real enough for Christ, he's probably very real to us as well. And I mean, all sorts of religions and practices have some embodiment of evil, whether in polytheistic or monotheistic religions. It's just that I think that you can't acknowledge that. You can't can well let me before I do a double negative. You shouldn't be ignoring it or not acknowledging that such evil exists. I mean, we can try and pathologize or secularize. Oh, we have social contagions. Well, I mean, there are various forms of evil which take place in things like ideologies can possess us. And why can't that not be the demonic? I mean, we take a look at sort of rapid onset gender dysphoria as a cultural example, where, oh, all of a sudden some 27-year-old has decided to change their perception of what they identify as with their in terms of gender, right? Whereas most of the time, any case of it, at least according to the literature, which already has its own problem because it has a replication crisis, that's another problem. So, but I mean, oh, and then what's the real cause? Well, access to things like, various forms of pornography, various forms of internet forums. I mean, one of the most, if you want to see a den of what I think is just demons, is just like go to Reddit and go to r/egg IRL, and you can just talk about all these people thinking like, oh, this person's going to be trans. I just got to like let them hatch and groom them into it. Like that's evil. Like I don't think you even need to be as like really hardcore God fearing to identify that that's fucked up, for lack of a better term, and apologize for swearing, but like I'm sorry, like that you have to acknowledge that in some instance, and refusal to is the old saying that evil wins when good men do nothing, and that's where we're at in that regard. And I'm very happy to see the okay groomer thing. I'm happy to see laws restricting it, no matter how milk toast, because I think for a very, very, very long time we've taken a beating, and now people are finally just saying, you know what, no, and we're watching them regress and seethe and recoil with such disgust and hatred over the fact that you said, no, this is wrong, this is morally incorrect, this is hurting people, this is the anathema of what I was raised to believe in. So yeah, no, I'm not going to do it, or I'm going to say no, and I'm going to relish in your defeat. That's to me that's a heartwarming sort of deal. That yeah, like evil's real, but I think that at the very least, those that are willing to say something and do something about it acknowledge it, and you have to formalize it because we've been saying it for a long time. And I think that the right, especially those that get ignored sort of on the dustbin side of history, like Pat Buchanan, right? Like a lot of the old right that we've listened to gets treated like Cassandra, the great soothsayer and oracle who would be giving these frightening and dark predictions, but would be ignored. And I think for once, at least someone's listening.
Well, and I feel like that, to circle slightly back around to realism, there's a certain level of just kind of like baseline human depravity that you can kind of understand, right? Like you're not really surprised when someone holds up a liquor store. It's not a good action, but you can trace the motivation to a certain extent, right? It's kind of more animalistic if we're going with Dante, right? Like it's the kind of the sins of the flesh. But there is something about this, and it really is like a satanic desire to kind of distort and corrupt that which is good. And I think that, and I've probably quoted this 3 times in 3 episodes, but there's this great Tolkien line talking about how orcs are created, where he says, evil cannot create, it can only corrupt. And I think that is what you see, and what you, especially with the trans stuff, right, is that evil can't make you a woman, but it can make you a disgusting, rotting corpse of a man, and that isn't, I don't know how to say this without being very blunt, and just say, like, if that isn't what the devil wants, what does he want? Right? Literally, like the horrible degradation of the human form, right? The form made in the image of God to a certain degree. And to me, it's I guess it makes me more confident as someone who has kind of comes more from that like robot brain, having a hard time rationalizing the spiritual world, right? If you kind of look around and you're like, all right, well, I don't think that this is just natural,
Yeah, no, I agree wholeheartedly. Actually, is just it was so much of what was good has been corrupted to serve the ends, I think, of what I mean, it is evil. I mean, you can't say, for instance, like, oh, what has been done in the name of good is always, hell. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? I think Dante had said it right that like on the way to hell is scattered with like the bones of priests and whatnot. Like, it just is illustrative to me that yeah, good intentions really they're corrupting intentions in the name of some corrupted form of the good. I mean, and sometimes it's not even sometimes it's done intentionally, right? There's a very famous LBJ quote that I'm not going to quote here because YouTube, but to have a certain group of people vote for them for the next 200 years, and what did you do? You created what was called, quote unquote, the Great Society, this way to build things up. And really, if we were to compare the quality of life in terms of like marriage, the number of children that are born with a two-parent household, the middle class, education, income growth for the Black community, and from 1965 to today, you can't tell me that's progress. That was basically cultural genocide of wealthy, middle class Black America that was turning into something good and turning into almost a level of parity economically, and like that you can't tell me that wasn't corruption in the Great Society. I mean, most things in politics, they're never what they claim to be. Like to take out the old boomer line, right? Like the Affordable Care Act was not affordable, right? Neither was the Great Society all that great. But yeah, I mean that's the thing is that there is some sense of evil, and I think that that's kind of what to me has really been the separating point, not just left and right, because there are people that things that are good and what we would call right wing sometimes aren't ever explicitly right wing. I can look at like a mountain valley of God's majesty and just know that this is true and just and beautiful no matter which way I look at it. I can't look at some disgusting parade of women that have taken their tops off and are pouring blood all over themselves to protest like PETA or to protest like slaughter or to protest a war that their government would expect them to be 100% on, despite the fact that their politics are 100% in line with the regime, right? It's evil, it's ugly, it's corrupting. So yeah, like you have to, because and you have to be wary of it, because sometimes you can be corrupted into thinking that you're doing the right thing, and I think that you see that a lot even in this sphere of politics as well online.
Well, I think that's a great spot to end it, Matt. Thank you so much for coming on the show. If we could just get your plugs and then we can head out.
Sure, you can find me on YouTube, Odyssey, Twitter, Substack. The best place that you can find all of my links is through this great website called findmyfriends.net, FINDMY, but it's friends spelled FRENS, like you see on Twitter all the time when someone gets respawned on Twitter. So findmyfriends.net/the Prudentialist. You'll find all of my links there. And of course, my YouTube channel, where every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern, I'll be streaming on some kind of international relations topic, whether it be theory, scholars, or just what the heck is going on in the world. And I hope to see you there.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Talk to you later, Matt.